Hello and welcome to this look at agricultural geographies. This opening slide demonstrates the complexity and the globalization and also the history of how we grow, how we produce food. In this lecture we're going to take a step back and we're going to examine the different agricultural revolutions starting about 14,000 years ago. We're going to fast forward into the present and see how our food system has become so globalized and how today we produce more food than is needed by our 7.5+ billion people on Earth. Towards the end of this lecture, we're going to take a look at food supply and access. So while we're able to produce more food than is needed, we still have parts of the world that are experiencing famine. We still have parts of our own communities that are malnourished or undernourished. So we'll take a look at food supply and access as we move towards the end of this lecture. Our first agricultural revolution began about 14,000 years ago. And we see that these different revolutions, or these different earth areas, started to sprout up in different parts of the world. What's interesting about this is it's not a diffusion of agricultural techniques and knowledge. Rather, these places independently began their own revolutions. And when we look back, we start to understand why this happened when it did. About 11,000 BCE, we started to see the end of the previous ice age. So our climates began to warm. As the climates began to warm, we started to have the advent or the availability of a growing season. So in our mid and lower latitudes, these areas became more humid, they became warmer. We didn't have winters where the ground froze. So we start to see our earliest hearths sprout up around these lower latitude areas. Within these different hearths, we found what's called domestication. And domestication refers to the control of the reproduction of a food supply. So in these areas, in places like China, we had millet and pigs. In the Fertile Crescent, we had sheep and goats and wheat. Over in the Americas, we had corn and beans and turkeys. So we started to see the control of the food supply. Once people were able to control their food supply, a new culture evolved, one that's known as sedentary, meaning people didn't need to hunt and gather. They didn't need to partake in a process called transhumance, where we move throughout the year with our herd. They were able to establish a sedentary, a settled lifestyle. So this first agricultural revolution also carries with it a cultural revolution. Once we started to produce food and control this process, our population grew slowly at first. But over time, we were able to increase our population growth because we had more food to support that population. When we look at where our first agricultural revolution took place, we find the Fertile Crescent. This area, what is in today Iraq, parts of Iran, parts of Syria, parts of Turkey, is where we start to find our first farming. Along with this farming, we also saw the advent of language. If you recall, when we examined language recently, that one of the hypotheses that explains when languages originated ties to agriculture. So the idea that we were creating a surplus of food, which contributed to the need for trade, which contributed to the need for language. So when we look at this part of the world, we could connect our first forms of agriculture, we could connect our original languages, and we could also connect our first cities and towns that reflect this sedentary lifestyle, and also a surplus of food because people were now able to specialize. Our population grew steadily for several thousand years, and some of the techniques that were introduced 10,000 years ago were still in play in the 1700s when we saw the advent of the Industrial Revolution in England. In the 1700s, England was experiencing a population explosion. Medicine had been created to make sure that our infant mortality rate dropped, sanitation improved, food supply, storage, transportation improved. So we were now in stage 2. We were reaching that population explosion in our industrialized country. England at this time was also at the forefront of studying the social change that was happening as our cities industrialized, as our populations were growing rapidly. A social critic at this time by the name of Thomas Malthus, who was introduced in earlier readings, came up with the population theory. Malthus said that our population was growing too fast and that food production was not going to keep up with the population growth. He examined events like famine and disease as what he called positive checks. Positive not meaning optimistic or good, rather positive meaning effective. That these checks, this famine, this disease, was able to limit population explosion, was able to be an effective check against too many people for our food supply. So Malthus said that the Earth's carrying capacity would be exceeded. And our carrying capacity is basically how the number of resources meets the population on Earth. Saying we don't have enough food to support population growth, not only here in England, but if this continues around the world. And you can see here in this simple chart where Malthus said that our population growth is geometric. Basically, we're going to keep doubling. Where we can't keep doubling our food supply. Our food supply is linear. While we could increase our food production, we're not going to be able to keep up with population growth. Now, we know that at the time Malthus was writing and researching that the global population was nearing 1 billion people. Today, that population is in excess of 7.5 billion, moving towards 8 billion. So Malthus had some ideas, had some concerns. He was an early critic and scientist or researcher in this field, but his Malthusian dilemma, as it became known, was disproved. And as we move through our different agricultural revolutions, we'll see some of the innovations that have allowed us to greatly increase our food supply much faster than our population growth. Our second agricultural revolution began around the time in the generations before the Industrial Revolution. In the 1700s, farmers started a process what's called crop rotation, meaning they found that their soil was more fertile, that they could sustain better yields if they rotated by year what they grew. So they could grow wheat one year, and then they could grow turnips the next, and then they could reintroduce wheat again. So by rotating the crops, it was keeping the soil fertile. It was reducing the amount of weeds and pests that could integrate the soil. They also used what today is a pretty simple tool called the steel plow. So the plow is able to turn over tough, dry soil. They were able to reach a subsurface that was fertile. So as the plow hooked up to a horse allowed for animal power or horsepower to drive the plow into the soil, reaching a fertile level. The 1800s saw an increased use of mechanization. So as we moved through the Industrial Revolution, tools such as threshers were now available for farmers. So we started to see an increase in efficiencies. These efficiencies meant that a farmer could farm more acreage, and it also meant that less labor was needed. So more people began to leave farms and move towards our cities, move towards our industrial economies. And in the 1900s, we saw the increased use of fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, technology. Not the modern technology and science we have today, but different techniques to reduce parasites, to increase efficiencies, and to increase yields. The results of this agricultural revolution, again, we were growing more food, so we were supporting that increasingly growing population. And we also see specialization and urbanization. So we see specialization in our economies and also an increasingly urban global population. When we chart population growth, again, we see that Malthus's ideas over 200 years ago really weren't practical. Now, we could look at this a couple ways. One, he's wrong, but two, he could not have predicted the efficiencies that were included in our more recent agricultural revolutions. And when we look at population growth today, we see rapid growth in East Asia and also South Asia, where we see more moderate growth in the Americas and Europe. So when we look at a chart like this, and when we look at our current population, we could ask ourselves, are we going to reach Earth's carrying capacity as far as natural resources supporting population growth? And do we still experience positive checks? Or should we consider things like famine and disease a positive check? Today we are in the midst of our third agricultural revolution. This was introduced by a individual, a geneticist, an agriculturalist named Norman Borlaug, an American who began practicing different types of modification, genetic modification, the application of science and biology and chemistry to farming. He started practicing this in the 1940s and 50s in Mexico. And this third revolution introduced new types of fertilizers, new types of biotechnology to increase our yields. Norman Borlaug found that monoculture, growing a single crop on a farm, was a way to increase our yield. And you'll notice this today when you go to rural farming areas, that a lot of our farms are either cornfields, where you might have hundreds of acres of corn, or you might have hundreds of acres of wheat. This type of monoculture, single production, reflects the green revolution, this third agricultural revolution. The increased use of mechanization and irrigation. So what we've done in this revolution is double the amount of arable land, meaning we are now able to farm on property that was considered too dry in the past. So by diverting water and introducing water to semi-arid and formerly, again, areas that were known as too dry, we're able to increase our yield. Really the collaborative nature of this revolution was seen in governments around the world, as this revolution wasn't a private practice, rather it was designed to share knowledge. It was something that was built out of academia. So around the world, different governments would adopt these practices promoted by Borlaug to stop famine, to feed rapidly growing populations. And this is important to subsidize production. So now a piece of a government's budget is designed to support agriculture. You might be familiar with the Farm Bill in the United States. Farmers in the United States are heavily subsidized to produce a surplus of dairy, a surplus of grain, to feed our population. Most of that food isn't directly sent to the consumer. It's used to produce other foods. So byproducts of corn are used to produce many of our other foods. And a lot of that corn is also sent to feed our animals, to feed our livestock, to feed our poultry. The results of this green revolution, yields were way up, through the roof. We also have an incredibly cheap and reliable food supply today. It's estimated that over 1 billion people were saved by the implementation, by the outcome of this green revolution. Norman Borlaug ended up winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 and was later awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian honor in the United States. So this revolution really has guided our last 50 years or so as our global populations have continued to grow and a steady food supply is present. An outcome of the third agricultural revolution is known as the gene revolution. So it started out as a lot of collaboration, a lot of subsidizing crops, subsidizing products to feed population, has evolved into more of a private sector activity. And the gene revolution continues to build upon the efficiencies and the yields produced in the green revolution, but at the same time we're seeing some concerning trends. You'll see here with patents and multinational corporations and genetically modified organisms. So the increased privatization of the food supply of seeds in particular is a concern for farmers. Farmers who don't have access to a lot of the seeds they need to enter contracts with companies like Monsanto, different multinational corporations. We also see an increasing concern in some of the modified foods that we're putting into our system, and what some of the long-term concerns are with our food source that's becoming more